The Wyoming Territory, 1856. Snow falls like ash across the frozen ground, where 17 handcarts should be moving toward Zion, but only twisted metal and scattered belongings remain. Dan McCready pulls his coat tighter, his breath forming clouds in the bitter air. 20 years of tracking outlaws taught him to read death scenes, but this massacre chills him to the bone. Then he hears it, a soft whimper from behind an overturned cart. 6-year-old Sam huddles against the wreckage, her parents' blood still warm on her torn dress. Dan knows he should ride away. His past as a federal marshal hunting Mormon fugitives makes him their enemy. One word from this child could expose everything. But when Sam's terrified eyes meet his, something breaks inside his chest. "I'll be your family," he whispers, taking her trembling hand. The child doesn't speak, only stares at him with eyes too old for her face. Dan has seen that look before, in mirrors, in wanted men just before they drew their final breath, in his own reflection after too many nights haunted by the choices that brought him here. He kneels beside her, noting the way she flinches when he moves too quickly. "Easy now," he murmurs, the same tone he once used to calm spooked horses. His weathered hands hover uncertainly over her small shoulders. "What's your name, little one?" "Samantha," she whispers, voice barely audible above the wind that cuts through the canyon walls. "But Papa calls me Sam." Her eyes dart to a motionless form sprawled near the cart's broken wheel, and Dan's chest tightens. The scene tells its story in blood and scattered flour, in overturned water barrels and torn canvas flapping like wounded birds. This wasn't random violence or desperate hunger. Someone came here with purpose, with enough men to overwhelm 17 families in minutes. The precision of it, the complete destruction, speaks to something darker than frontier desperation. Dan's trained eye catches details others might miss, the way bodies fell in defensive positions around the women and children, spent shell casings glinting in the snow, tracks leading both to and from the massacre site. Professional work, military precision, but who would want to butcher Mormon pioneers with such calculated brutality? "Sam," he says carefully, "did you see who did that?" The child's grip on his hand tightens until her small fingers dig into his scarred knuckles. She nods once, quickly, then shakes her head as if trying to unsee whatever horrors played out before her young eyes. "Bad men," she whispers. "They wore blue coats like soldiers, but Papa said they weren't real soldiers. They had mean faces and they smelled like whiskey." Her voice drops even lower. "The leader had yellow hair and a scar right here." She traces a line down her left cheek with one trembling finger. Dan's blood turns to ice water. Yellow hair, scarred cheek, false uniforms. He knows exactly who she's describing. Captain Marcus Flint, discharged from the Union Army for war crimes, now leading a gang of deserters and cutthroats across the territories. If Flint is behind this massacre, then Sam isn't just orphaned, she's marked for death. Flint never leaves witnesses. The wind shifts, carrying the metallic scent of blood and something else that makes Dan's skin crawl. Horses, approaching fast from the east. He counts hoofbeats by instinct, 6 riders, maybe 7, pushing hard despite the treacherous snow. His hand moves to the Colt, 45 at his hip, thumb automatically checking the hammer's position. "Sam, listen to me." He keeps his voice steady despite the urgency clawing at his throat. "We need to leave, right now." She looks up at him with those devastating eyes, and he sees his own damnation reflected there. Taking her means protecting her. Protecting her means facing Flint again. And facing Flint means confronting the ghosts of every choice that drove Dan from his badge, his home, his name into this frozen wilderness where Mormon pioneers see him as their persecutor. The bitter irony cuts deeper than the Wyoming wind. Dan McCready spent 5 years hunting these people for the federal government, driving them from their homes, separating their families. Now he's promising to become family to one of their children, swearing an oath that might cost them both their lives. "Are you really going to be my family?" Sam asks, and the naked hope in her voice nearly undoes him. The hoofbeats grow closer. Dan scoops Sam into his arms, feeling how light she is, how fragile against the vast brutality of this territory that devours the innocent without ceremony or conscience. His horse stamps nervously, sensing the approaching danger. "Yes," he tells her, meaning it with every broken piece of his soul. "I promise." As they ride hard toward the tree line, Dan doesn't look back at the massacre site. But he can feel it behind them like a curse, along with the approaching riders who'll find Sam's footprints in the snow and know she escaped their slaughter. The hunt has begun. The child's fever broke sometime before dawn, her small body finally relaxing against the makeshift bedroll Dan had fashioned from his spare shirt and coat. He'd kept the fire burning through the night, feeding it precious wood he'd scavenged from the wagon's remains, watching her face for signs of change in the flickering orange light. When the first pale fingers of sunrise crept across the horizon, she opened her eyes. They were the color of prairie grass in summer, green with flecks of gold, and they fixed on him with a wariness that made his chest tight. Too much wariness for a child who couldn't be more than 7 or 8 years old. "Easy there, little one," he said softly, not moving from where he sat cross-legged beside the fire. "You're safe now." She didn't speak, just studied him with those old eyes. Her gaze took in his weathered face, the scar that ran from his left temple to his jaw, the way his hand rested near his rifle. Smart child. The frontier taught such lessons early to those who lived. "I'm Dan," he said, keeping his voice gentle. "Can you tell me your name?" Her lips parted, then closed again. She tried to sit up, wincing as the movement pulled at her burns. He reached out instinctively to steady her, then stopped when she flinched back. "It's all right," he murmured. "I won't hurt you. Promise." Something in his tone must have reached her, because the rigid fear in her shoulders eased a fraction. When she spoke, her voice came out as barely more than a whisper. "Sarah, Sarah." He nodded, filing the name away like a precious thing. "That's a fine name. Are you hungry, Sarah?" She nodded once, quick and sharp, and he reached for his pack. His supplies were meager: hardtack, jerky, a small pouch of cornmeal, enough for one man to make it to the next settlement, but with a child to feed, the calculations changed entirely. He pushed the thought aside and focused on mixing cornmeal with water from his canteen, forming it into small cakes he could cook on the hot stones around the fire. While the makeshift bread cooked, he studied their surroundings in the growing light. The burned remains of the handcart told a grim story. Arrows buried deep in the wooden sides, scattered belongings, the dark stains in the dirt that he'd learned not to examine too closely. Another family that had trusted in Providence and found only violence instead. The tracks around the site were 2 days old, maybe 3. Whoever had done this was long gone, but that didn't mean they were safe. This stretch of country harbored all manner of dangers, from war parties to wolves to the simple, brutal mathematics of exposure and starvation. "Sarah," he said carefully, turning one of the corn cakes with his knife blade. "Do you remember what happened here?" Her small hands clenched in the fabric of her torn dress. She stared into the fire for a long moment before speaking. "Mama told me to hide under the blankets in the cart. She said not to come out no matter what I heard." Her voice was steady, matter-of-fact in the way children's voices could be when they spoke of terrible things. "I heard shooting and screaming. Then it got quiet for a long time." "How long were you there before I found you?" "Don't know. The sun went down twice, I think. Maybe 3 times. She looked up at him then, and he saw the question she was afraid to ask. Are Mama and Papa?" Dan felt something crack open in his chest. He'd found no other survivors, no bodies that could be properly buried. Just scattered bones that the scavengers had already claimed, and this one small miracle of a child who'd stayed hidden when her world burned down around her. "I'm sorry, Sarah." She nodded once, accepting the terrible truth with a composure that made him want to put his fist through something. No child should have to learn such acceptance. The corn cakes were done. He split one open, blowing on it to cool the steaming interior, then handed it to her. She ate with careful, controlled bites. the way children ate when food was never certain. "Where were you headed?" he asked. "Salt Lake City. Papa said we'd have a house there, and I could go to school." She paused, a shadow crossing her face. "What happens to me now?" The question hung between them like smoke from the dying fire. Dan knew the brutal arithmetic of frontier survival. A single man could barely scratch out an existence in this country. A man with a child to protect faced odds that would make seasoned gamblers walk away from the table. But looking at her small, solemn face, at the way she held herself together through sheer will, he found himself saying something that would change both their lives forever. "You come with me." The words were simple, but they carried the weight of promise, of responsibility that could mean the difference between life and death for both of them. The child's fever broke on the third day, but Dan knew they couldn't stay much longer. Winter was closing its fist around the mountains, and every hour they remained in the makeshift shelter meant another mile they'd have to push harder when they finally moved. She'd told him her name was Sarah, whispered it through cracked lips while he spooned warm broth between them. 8 years old, maybe 9. Her parents had been part of a late company, one of those foolish groups that thought they could beat the snows with nothing but faith and determination. The burned handcart told the rest of the story. Dan studied the map he'd drawn in the dirt floor of their shelter, using a charred stick to mark the landmarks he remembered. Fort Bridger was closest, maybe 6 days if they pushed hard and the weather held. But Bridger meant questions, and questions meant trouble for a man like him. The other option was striking south toward the Mormon settlements in Salt Lake Valley, but that route would take them through hostile territory with winter breathing down their necks. "Mr. Dan?" Sarah's voice was stronger now, though still thin as mountain air. "Are we gonna die out here like Mama and Papa?" He looked up from his crude map. The child sat wrapped in his extra blanket, her dark eyes too old for her face. He'd seen that look before, in the mirror and in the faces of other survivors who learned too young that the world was teeth and claws, wrapped in pretty promises. "No," he said simply. "We're not." "How do you know?" "Because I've already died once," he thought. "Because there's nothing left in me for this wilderness to kill." But he couldn't say that to a child who'd just lost everything. "Because I made you a promise," he said instead. "And I keep my promises." She seemed to accept this, nodding gravely. Papa always said promises were sacred things. Dan felt something twist in his chest at her words. Sacred things. He'd believed in sacred things once, before Nauvoo burned and the trek west turned into a meat grinder of faith and flesh, before he'd done the things that put a price on his head and blood on his hands. That afternoon, he ventured out to scout their route and found wolf tracks in the fresh snow. The pack was following a game trail that ran parallel to the path they'd need to take. He counted at least 5 distinct prints, maybe more. Hungry wolves and a sick child made for poor traveling companions. When he returned to the shelter, Sarah was sitting up and attempting to eat some of the jerky he'd left for her. Good. She'd need her strength for what was coming. "We leave at first light," he told her. "Can you walk?" She nodded, though he could see the uncertainty in her eyes. "Where are we going?" "South. There's a settlement called Cedar Fort, maybe 10 days if we're lucky. Longer if the snows come hard. Will there be people like us there?" Like us. As if a broken-down gunfighter and an orphaned pioneer child were cut from the same cloth. Maybe they were in a way. Both of them refugees from a world that had no use for the inconvenient or the unlucky. "There'll be people who'll take you in," he said. "Good people. What about you?" The question hung in the cold air between them. What about him indeed? He'd been running for 3 years now, ever since that bloody night in Far West when everything went wrong. The church wanted him dead for what he'd done, and the government wanted him hanged for what he'd failed to do. Men like him didn't get to settle down in places like Cedar Fort. "I'll make sure you're safe," he said. "That's what matters." That night, as Sarah slept curled against his side for warmth, Dan lay awake, listening to the wind howl through the rocks above them. Somewhere out there, wolves prowled through the darkness. Somewhere behind them, his past waited like a patient hunter. and somewhere ahead lay a future he couldn't see clearly, full of promises he might not be able to keep. He thought about the wanted posters that might be circulating, the description that would mark him as Danforth Kelly, late of the Nauvoo Legion, suspected in the deaths of 3 federal marshals. The beard he'd grown helped, as did the years that had carved lines around his eyes and grey into his hair. But recognition was always just one sharp-eyed witness away. The child stirred in her sleep, murmuring something he couldn't make out. Her small hand clutched at his sleeve, as if even in dreams she was afraid of being left alone again. Dan closed his eyes and tried to remember the last time someone had depended on him for anything but violence. Tomorrow they'd start walking. Tomorrow the real test would begin. The child's fever broke sometime before dawn, her small body finally relaxing into peaceful sleep against Dan's chest. He had kept the fire burning through the night, feeding it precious fuel while she shivered and mumbled incoherently about her mama and papa. Now, as pale morning light filtered through the canyon walls, he allowed himself a moment of relief. She would live, at least through today. Dan studied her face in the growing light, maybe 6 years old, with tangled brown hair and skin bronzed by the prairie sun. Her dress, once blue calico, was torn and stained with soot and blood. Not her blood, he realized with a grim tightening in his chest. The massacre at the Handcart had been thorough. The girl stirred, her eyes fluttering open. They were green as spring grass, wide and frightened as they fixed on his bearded face. "Easy now," he said softly, the way he might gentle a spooked horse. "You're safe." She scrambled backward, pressing herself against the rock wall, her breathing sharp and quick. Dan didn't move, keeping his hands visible and his voice low. "My name's Dan. I found you yesterday by the wagons. Do you remember?" The girl's eyes darted around the small shelter, taking in the dying fire, his bedroll, the rifle propped against the canyon wall. Her gaze lingered on the weapon before returning to his face. "Where's Mama?" Her voice was barely a whisper, hoarse from smoke and crying. Dan felt the familiar weight settle on his chest, the same crushing responsibility he'd carried through too many conversations with too many orphans. The war had given him practice at delivering impossible news to children, but it never got easier. "I'm sorry, little one. Your Mama, she's gone." The girl's face crumpled, but no tears came. She had cried herself empty already. "Papa too?" "Yes." She nodded once, a terrible adult understanding in those young eyes. The frontier-aged children quickly forced them to accept truths that should have been years away. Dan had seen it countless times, but it still cut deep. "What's your name?" he asked. "Sarah." She hugged her knees to her chest. "Sarah Millfield." "Well, Sarah Millfield, are you hungry?" She shook her head, though he could see the lie in the hollow of her cheeks. Children often refused food when grief overwhelmed them. He'd have to be patient, coax her back to the business of living. Dan reached slowly for his saddlebags, pulling out a piece of hardtack and his water flask. He took a sip and bit off a corner of the hard biscuit, chewing thoughtfully while she watched. "I was thinking," he said between bites, "that I could use some company on the trail. Gets mighty lonesome riding alone. You wouldn't happen to be looking for somewhere to go, would you?" Sarah's eyes narrowed with suspicious hope. "Where are you going?" "California. Got some business there." The half-truth came easily. He did have business in California, though not the kind he could explain to a child. "There's good people there. Families who'd welcome a smart girl like you. I don't want another family." Her voice carried a stubborn edge that reminded him of his sister at that age. "I want mine back." "I know you do." Dan set down the hardtack and leaned forward slightly. "But sometimes wanting and getting are two different things. Sometimes we have to make the best of what we've got left." He knew those words intimately, had lived by them since the night everything changed, since he'd made the choice that put him on this endless run westward. The past was a luxury he couldn't afford, and neither could she. Sarah was quiet for a long moment, staring at her hands. When she looked up again, some of the fear had been replaced by calculation. Smart girl, weighing her options like a seasoned trader. "If I come with you," she said slowly, "Will you teach me to shoot?" The question caught him off guard. That's not something little girls usually. "I'm not a little girl anymore." Her voice carried the weight of yesterday's horror. "Little girls have mamas and papas to protect them." Dan studied her face, seeing the steel beneath the grief. The frontier demanded hard choices from everyone, even children barely old enough to tie their own shoes. Who was he to tell her she couldn't be what survival required? "All right," he said finally. "I'll teach you to shoot. But first you eat something, and we get you cleaned up proper. Can't have folks thinking I don't know how to care for my—" He paused, searching for the right word. "Your what?" Sarah asked. Dan met her eyes, knowing that whatever he said next would bind them together in ways that might destroy them both. The men hunting him wouldn't hesitate to hurt a child to get to him. Taking her along was selfish, dangerous, probably wrong. But leaving her alone would be certain death. "My family," he said quietly. "Can't have folks thinking I don't know how to care for my family." The child's fever broke on the third day, but Dan knew they couldn't stay beside the creek much longer. His horse had grown restless, ears constantly swiveling toward sounds only it could hear, and the buzzards that had been circling the burned handcart had moved on, which meant other scavengers would soon investigate what remained. He knelt beside the makeshift shelter he'd built from salvaged canvas and watched the girl sleep. Color had returned to her cheeks, and her breathing came steady and deep. She was stronger than she looked, this little one. Had to be, to survive what she'd survived. "What's your name?" he'd asked when she'd finally stayed awake long enough to sip some broth. "Ursi," she'd whispered, her voice like dried leaves. The name hit him harder than it should have. Mercy, something he'd stopped believing in long ago, yet here she was, breathing proof that sometimes the wilderness gave back instead of just taking. A twig snapped somewhere in the cottonwoods upstream. Dan's hand found his rifle without conscious thought, and he studied the shadows between the trees. Nothing moved, but the feeling crawled up his spine anyway, the same instinct that had kept him alive through 3 winters of running. They needed to move. Today. He'd spent the morning going through what remained salvageable from the handcart. Most of it was ash and twisted metal, but he'd found a few items the fire had missed. A small leather-bound book with pages only singed around the edges, a wooden doll with a cracked face, and tucked deep in a corner where the flames hadn't reached, a letter addressed to someone named Thomas Whitmore in Salt Lake City. Dan studied the letter again as Mercy stirred awake. The paper was good quality, and the handwriting spoke of education. These hadn't been poor immigrants making their way west on desperation alone. They'd been people of some standing, which made their deaths even more troubling. "Are you my papa now?" Mercy asked, sitting up slowly. The question caught him off guard. He looked down at her thin face, at eyes that held too much knowledge for someone so young. I'm going to take care of you. Get you somewhere safe. Mama said if anything happened, I should find good people. She said God would send someone." Mercy clutched the damaged doll to her chest. "Are you good people?" The innocent faith in her voice made something twist in his chest. Good people. If she only knew what he'd done, what he was running from. But she was looking at him with such trust, such hope, that he couldn't bring himself to shatter it. "I'll do my best to be," he said finally. "Think you can ride today? We need to get moving." She nodded solemnly. "Mama taught me. Said pioneer children have to be brave." While Mercy ate the last of their rabbit stew, Dan broke camp and loaded his supplies. He'd fashioned a sling from canvas to carry her if she grew too tired, but she insisted on trying the horse first. When he lifted her up in front of his saddle, she felt light as a bird, all sharp angles and fragile bones. They followed the creek north for an hour before striking out across open country. The mountains rose ahead of them, purple and forbidding against the afternoon sky. Somewhere in those peaks lay the passes that would take them toward Salt Lake City, toward people who might be looking for this child, who might give her the family she deserved. But those same mountains held other dangers. The early snow that had already dusted the high country, the Indians who knew these lands better than any white man ever would, and the possibility that whoever had killed her family might still be hunting survivors. "Tell me about your mama and papa," Dan said as they rode, partly to keep Mercy talking, partly because he needed to know what they might be riding into. Papa was going to build houses in the valley, big houses with glass windows, and Mama was going to have a garden with flowers, not just vegetables. Mercy's voice grew dreamy with memory. She showed me pictures in her book, roses and lilacs and morning glories that climb up walls. "Sounds nice," she said in Zion. "Everything grows beautiful and nothing ever dies." Mercy was quiet for a moment, but she died, so maybe we weren't in Zion yet. The simple logic of it, the way she tried to make sense of senseless loss, made Dan's throat tight. He'd stopped believing in Zion years ago, stopped believing that anything grew without paying for it in blood and tears. A hawk circled overhead, riding thermals he couldn't feel. In the distance, a line of dark clouds gathered along the horizon. Weather coming, and them still a day's ride from any real shelter. "Hold on tight," he told Mercy, and urged the horse into a faster gait. Behind them, smoke rose from a dozen cooking fires he couldn't see. The storm hit them like the wrath of an angry god, turning the world white and merciless in the space of minutes. Dan felt it coming in his bones first, that familiar ache that spoke of weather change and old wounds, but even his scarred body hadn't prepared him for the ferocity that descended from the iron-grey sky. "Stay close!" he shouted over the howling wind, pulling Mercy against his side as snow began to slash horizontally across the trail. The mule brayed in protest, its ears pinned back against the assault. They'd been making good time since dawn, the path winding through a narrow valley between two steep ridges. Now those same ridges that had sheltered them from the worst of the sun's heat became a funnel for the wind, channeling it into a screaming torrent that threatened to tear them from their feet. Dan squinted through the whirling snow, searching desperately for any kind of shelter. The visibility dropped to mere yards, then feet. Mercy's small hand clutched at his coat, and he could feel her trembling through the fabric. "There," he called, spotting what might have been an outcropping of rock ahead. He pulled the mule forward, each step a battle against the wind that seemed determined to drive them back. The dark shape resolved into a shallow cave, barely more than a deep recess in the stone wall, but it would have to do. Dan pushed Mercy inside first, then coaxed the reluctant mule to follow. The space was cramped with the three of them pressed together, but at least the howling wind became a dull roar instead of a deafening assault. "Is it going to stop?" Mercy asked, her voice small in the sudden relative quiet. Dan stripped the packs from the mule's back, his movements practiced despite the confined space. Eventually, storms like this, they burn themselves out quick, but they're fierce while they last. He pulled out their bedroll and wrapped it around Mercy's shoulders, noting how her lips had taken on a bluish tinge. The temperature had dropped 20 degrees in as many minutes, and the wind made it feel even colder. "Tell me about Salt Lake City," she said suddenly, her teeth chattering. "What's it like?" Dan paused in his unpacking, caught off guard by the question. He'd been so focused on getting them there alive that he hadn't given much thought to what would happen when they arrived. "It's different from what you're used to. Bigger than any place you've seen, I'd wager. Streets laid out neat and proper, houses with real glass windows. Will I like it?" The simple question hit him harder than it should have. Would she like it? Would she fit into the rigid structure of Mormon society? Would they accept a half-Indian child with no family name and a past written in ash and blood? "I think you'll find good people there," he said carefully. "Folks who'll help you make a life." Mercy was quiet for a moment, watching the snow swirl past the cave opening. "What about you? Will you stay?" Dan felt that familiar tightness in his chest, the one that came whenever his past pressed too close to the surface. Salt Lake City held memories he'd spent 3 years trying to outrun. Going back meant facing questions he wasn't ready to answer, confronting a life he'd abandoned in disgrace and fury. "We'll see," he said, which wasn't really an answer at all. The storm raged for hours, showing no sign of weakening. Dan rationed their water and shared out strips of dried meat, trying not to think about how their supplies were dwindling faster than he'd planned. The detour to avoid the Apache hunting party had cost them time and distance, and now this storm would cost them more. As darkness fell, the temperature dropped even further. Dan could see his breath misting in the air, and Mercy had curled into a tight ball despite the bedroll wrapped around her. The mule shifted restlessly, its body heat the only thing keeping the small cave from becoming an icebox. "Come here," Dan said, opening his coat. "We need to share warmth." Mercy didn't argue. Pressing close against his side, he wrapped his arms around her, feeling how small and fragile she was beneath the layers of cloth and fur. Her breathing gradually steadied as his body heat warmed her, but he remained awake, listening to the storm and thinking. 3 years he'd been running from Salt Lake City, from the accusations and the shame and the blood on his hands. 3 years of telling himself he was better off alone, that he'd left too much destruction in his wake to ever go back. But now, with this child depending on him, he found himself wondering if redemption was possible, if a man could carry enough guilt to damn himself forever, or if sometimes the weight of protecting the innocent could balance the scales. Outside, the wind began to die down, its fury finally spent, but Dan knew the real storm was still ahead of them, waiting in the city he'd once called home. The child's fever broke just before dawn, her small body finally releasing the tension that had held her rigid through the night. Dan felt the change in her breathing first, the shallow gasps giving way to something deeper, more natural. He pressed his palm against her forehead and found it cool and damp with sweat. "There's my girl," he whispered, allowing himself the first full breath he'd taken in hours. Lucy's eyes fluttered open, unfocused at first, then finding his face in the dim light filtering through the cave entrance. She tried to sit up, but Dan's gentle hand on her shoulder kept her still. "Easy now. You've been fighting something fierce, but you won." "I dreamed about Mama," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. She was singing. Dan's throat tightened. What was she singing? The song about the valley, the one with no sorrow. Lucy's eyes searched his face. "Do you know it?" He did know it. Every Mormon pioneer knew "Come, come, ye saints." Eliza used to hum it while she worked, her voice carrying across their small cabin like a promise of better days. He'd tried to forget the words after she died, but they lived in his bones now, carved there by grief and memory. "I know it," he said simply. Lucy struggled to sit up again, and this time he helped her, propping her against the cave wall. She was weak but alert, her color already better than it had been. The willow bark tea had done its work, and her body had fought off whatever poison the infected cut had tried to spread through her system. "Are we still hiding?" she asked. "For now, but we'll move on today once you're stronger." She nodded gravely, accepting this as children accepted most things, with a resilience that both amazed and broke his heart. No child should have to learn such adaptability, yet here on the frontier, it was often the difference between living and dying. Dan gathered their meager supplies, organizing everything they'd need for the trail ahead. The cave had served them well, but staying in one place too long was dangerous. Riders could be anywhere, and winter was coming whether they were ready or not. "Dan," Lucy's voice was small, "what happens if you get sick like I did?" The question hit him like a physical blow. He'd been so focused on keeping her alive that he hadn't considered what would happen to her if he fell. Out here, alone, she wouldn't last 2 days. "I won't get sick," he said, but the words felt hollow even to him. "But what if you do? What if you die like everyone else?" He turned to face her fully, seeing the fear she'd been carrying beneath her brave exterior. This child had watched her family burn, had nearly died herself from infection, and now faced the terrifying possibility of being abandoned again. Her courage wasn't fearlessness. It was the desperate strength of someone who had already lost everything once. "Lucy, look at me." He knelt beside her, his voice steady and sure. "I made you a promise. You remember what I said?" She nodded. "That you'd be my family now, That's right, and I keep my promises. All of them. No matter what. But how can you promise something like that? You can't control everything. The wisdom in her words unsettled him. She was right, of course. He couldn't control bullets or sickness or the 100 other ways the frontier could kill a man. But he could control his commitment to her, his willingness to fight for her life even at the cost of his own. "You're right that I can't control everything," he said. "But I can control this. I will not leave you. Not by choice, not without a fight. And if something does happen to me, I'll make sure you're safe first. I'll find you people who care for you the way you deserve." "What people?" "There's a settlement 3 days north. Good people. They'd take you in." Lucy was quiet for a long moment, processing this information with the solemnity of someone far older than her years. Finally, she reached out and took his hand. "I don't want other people," she said. "I want you to be my family." The simple declaration nearly undid him. When had he last been wanted by anyone? When had anyone looked at him and seen something worth keeping rather than something to fear or avoid? "Then that's what I'll be," he said, "for as long as you'll have me." Outside, the morning wind picked up, carrying the scent of snow from the mountains. They needed to move soon, needed to put more distance between themselves and whatever pursuit might be following. But for just this moment, in the shelter of stone and shadow, they were safe, they were family, and that was worth fighting for. The fever broke on the 3rd morning, leaving Sarah weak as a newborn colt but alive. Dan watched her eyelids flutter open, those green eyes focusing on his face with recognition for the first time in days. Relief flooded through him so suddenly he had to grip the edge of the makeshift bed to steady himself. "Water," she whispered, her voice cracked and small. He lifted her head gently, supporting it with one calloused palm, while holding a cup to her lips with the other. She drank in tiny sips, and he could feel the tremor in her neck muscles, the exhaustion that ran bone deep. "Where are we?" she asked, after finishing half the cup. "Safe place. Old trading post." He set the water aside and studied her face. The flush of fever had faded, leaving her pale but clear-eyed. "How do you feel?" "Like I got trampled by a whole cattle drive." She tried to sit up and winced, but better, different better. Dan nodded. He knew that feeling, the strange lightness that came after surviving something that should have killed you, the peculiar gratitude mixed with disbelief that your heart was still beating. Over the following days, Sarah's strength returned gradually. She could sit up without assistance, then stand for short periods, then walk the length of the small room without stopping to rest. Dan found himself watching her more carefully than he'd watched enemy positions during the war, cataloguing every sign of improvement, every indication that she was truly healing. But as her body mended, her questions multiplied. "Why don't you ever talk about before?" she asked one evening as they shared a supper of rabbit stew. "Before you found me, I mean." Dan's spoon paused halfway to his mouth. "Not much worth talking about. Everyone's got something worth talking about. Ma used to say a person's stories are what make them real. Your Ma sounds like she was a wise woman." Sarah leaned forward, fixing him with that direct stare that reminded him uncomfortably of a judge sizing up a defendant. "You're doing it again." "Doing what?" "Turning the talk away from yourself. You do it every time I ask about you." Dan set down his spoon and reached for his coffee cup, buying time. The girl was too observant by half, too smart for her own good, maybe. Or his. "Some stories are better left buried, little one." "But they don't stay buried, do they?" Sarah's voice was quiet but persistent. "I can see them sometimes in your eyes. When you think I'm not looking, they're still there, eating at you." The accuracy of her observation hit him like a physical blow. He stood abruptly, chair scraping against the wooden floor. "I'm going to check the horses." Outside, in the cool evening air, Dan leaned against the corral fence and tried to push down the memories that Sarah's words had stirred up. But they rose anyway, unbidden and unwelcome. The sound of cannon fire echoing across blood-soaked fields, the weight of decisions that sent good men to their deaths, the faces of the dead that visited him in dreams. And other memories, too. darker ones that he'd tried to drown in whiskey and bury in distance, the things he'd done in the name of survival, the lines he'd crossed that couldn't be uncrossed. When he returned to the cabin, Sarah was cleaning their supper dishes with careful, deliberate movements. She looked up as he entered but didn't press him with more questions. Instead, she said, "I've been thinking about what happens next. Next, when I'm strong enough to travel. Where do we go?" Dan had been avoiding that very question. Winter was coming, and they'd need to find somewhere to wait it out. Somewhere safe. But safety was a luxury he'd never been able to afford for long. "There's settlements further west," he said finally. "California, Oregon Territory. Places where folks don't ask too many questions about a man's past." Sarah nodded thoughtfully. "That sounds good. A fresh start." She paused, then added, "For both of us." Something in her tone made him look at her more sharply. There was a weight to those words, a significance he didn't fully understand. "Sarah, is there something you're not telling me?" She met his gaze steadily. "Seems to me we've both got things we're not telling. The difference is, I'm willing to wait until you're ready to trust me with yours." The simple honesty of it struck him silent. Here was this child, this orphaned girl who had every reason to be afraid of the world and everyone in it, offering him patience and understanding he didn't deserve. "Why?" he asked quietly. "Because you saved me. Because you stayed when you could have left. Because even if you've got demons chasing you, they haven't made you cruel." She dried her hands on a piece of cloth and looked at him with eyes that seemed far too old for her face. "And because I think maybe we can save each other." The morning sun cut through the canyon walls like a blade, casting long shadows that danced across the rocky ground where Dan knelt beside the small fire. His hands shook as he poured water from their dwindling supply into the battered tin cup, watching steam rise in thin wisps. 3 days had passed since they'd entered Devil's Backbone, and the passage had proven every bit as treacherous as its name suggested. Sarah sat propped against her bedroll, her face pale but determined. The fever had broken during the night, leaving her weak but lucid. She watched Dan with those unnervingly perceptive eyes that seemed to see straight through to his soul. "You didn't sleep again," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Dan forced a smile as he brought her the warm water. Someone had to keep watch. Drink this. But Sarah was right. Sleep had become his enemy, bringing dreams that clawed at him with memories he'd tried so hard to bury. Dreams of another child, another promise broken. Dreams of flames and screaming and the weight of choices that could never be undone. "Tell me about before," Sarah said, after taking a careful sip. "Before you found me." The simple request hit him like a physical blow. Dan turned away, busying himself with checking their meager supplies. 2 days of hardtack remaining, maybe 3 if they rationed carefully. The water would last longer, thanks to a small spring they'd found yesterday, but winter was closing in fast, and the high passes ahead would test them both. "Not much to tell," he said finally. "Just traveling. You're lying." The words were spoken without accusation, just a matter-of-fact observation that made his chest tighten. He looked back at her, this small girl who'd somehow become the center of his world in such a short time, and saw something in her expression that reminded him painfully of himself at that age, the look of someone who'd learned too early that adults couldn't always be trusted. "Sarah, it's about the nightmares, isn't it?" She set down the cup and pulled the blanket tighter around her shoulders. "You call out names sometimes. Anna, Jacob." The names hit him like bullets, each one tearing through the careful walls he'd built around those memories. His breath caught, and for a moment the canyon walls seemed to close in around him. "I had a family once," he heard himself saying, the words pulled from some deep place he'd sworn never to revisit. "Back in Nauvoo, before the troubles, before we had to leave." Sarah waited, patient as stone, and somehow that patience broke something loose inside him. "Anna was my wife. Jacob was our boy. 5 years old, with hair like corn silk and a laugh that could light up the darkest day. Dan's voice cracked, but he forced himself to continue. When the mobs came, when they burned the temple and drove us out, I thought I could protect them, thought I could keep them safe on the trail west. The morning light had shifted, and the shadows had grown shorter, but Dan felt as if he were back in that terrible winter of 1846, watching the life drain from his son's eyes while fever consumed him and his wife wasted away from grief and exposure. The cholera took Jacob first. Anna lasted 3 more weeks before she just gave up, said she couldn't bear a world without him. He looked down at his scarred hands, remembering how helpless they'd felt. I buried them both beside the Platte River, marked their graves with stones that the wind probably scattered years ago. Sarah's small hand found his, her touch warm despite the morning chill. Is that why you saved me? Because of them? The question hung between them like a bridge neither had dared cross until now. Dan felt the weight of it, the terrible complexity of truth and guilt and hope all tangled together. Maybe, he admitted. Or maybe you saved me. Hard to tell the difference sometimes. A sound echoed from the canyon entrance, the distant whinny of horses and the low murmur of voices. Dan's head snapped up, every instinct screaming danger. He recognized that particular cadence, the way the sound carried off the rock walls, riders, multiple horses, moving with purpose. Get down, he whispered urgently, helping Sarah flatten against the rocky ground behind their meager camp. Don't make a sound. His hand found the grip of his Colt, thumb checking the cylinder out of habit. 6 shots, and from the sound of it, at least 4 riders approaching. Not impossible odds, but not good ones either, especially with Sarah to protect. The voices grew clearer as they approached, and Dan's blood turned to ice water in his veins. He recognized the harsh laugh that bounced off the canyon walls, the distinctive drawl that had haunted his nightmares for months. Marcus Steele had found them. The wind carried the scent of smoke long before they saw the settlement. Dan pulled his horse to a stop on the ridge overlooking the valley, his weathered hand instinctively moving to the rifle across his saddle. Below them, Fort Bridger sprawled like a collection of scattered bones against the brown earth, its wooden walls and trading posts bustling with activity that seemed almost foreign after weeks in the wilderness. "Is that where we're going?" Eliza asked, her voice barely above a whisper. She'd grown quiet these past few days, as if sensing something in Dan's increasingly restless demeanor. "For supplies," he said, though the words felt like gravel in his throat. "Won't be long." But even as he spoke, Dan knew he was lying. Fort Bridger meant people, and people meant questions. Questions about a man traveling alone with a child who bore no resemblance to him. Questions about where they'd come from and where they were headed. Questions he couldn't answer without unraveling everything. They descended into the valley as the afternoon sun cast long shadows across the trading post. The settlement buzzed with the controlled chaos of frontier commerce. Trappers haggling over pelts, emigrants restocking their wagons, soldiers in dust-caked uniforms moving with purposeful stride. Dan kept his hat low and his eyes lower as they approached the main trading post. "Stay close," he murmured to Eliza, helping her down from her horse. "Don't wander off." Inside the trading post, the air hung thick with the mingled scents of leather, tobacco, and unwashed bodies. Dan moved methodically through his list: salt, ammunition, medical supplies. Each transaction was brief, businesslike, designed to draw no attention. But he could feel eyes on him, the weight of curious glances that lingered too long on Eliza's small form beside him. "That your daughter?" The question came from a bearded trapper examining a display of knives nearby. His tone was casual, conversational, but Dan heard the probing edge beneath it. Yes, the lie came easier this time, though it still left a bitter taste. Pretty little thing. Got her mother's eyes, I'd wager. Dan's jaw tightened. "Supplies are ready," he said to the clerk, cutting the conversation short. But as he turned to leave, another voice stopped him cold. "Well, I'll be damned. Dan Morrison." The blood drained from Dan's face. Slowly, he turned to see a familiar figure emerging from behind a stack of grain sacks. Marshal Tom Carpenter, a man Dan had hoped never to see again. The marshal's badge caught the lamplight as he approached, his eyes already taking in every detail of the scene before him. "Been a long time, Morrison. Heard you'd gone respectable, joined up with the Mormons." Carpenter's gaze shifted to Eliza, and Dan saw recognition flicker there, not of the child herself, but of something else, something that made Dan's blood run cold. "Marshal!" Dan kept his voice level, though his hand drifted closer to his gun. "Just passing through." "I'm sure you are." Carpenter stepped closer, his voice dropping. "Funny thing, though, got word from a cavalry patrol about a week back. Found some burned wagons up north, whole family dead. Except they never found the little girl." His eyes fixed on Eliza again. About her age, they figured. The trading post seemed to grow quiet around them, though Dan knew it was just the roaring in his own ears. Eliza pressed closer to his side, sensing the tension without understanding its source. "Lot of tragedy on these trails," Dan said carefully. "Never know what you might find." "Toe," Carpenter agreed, his hand resting casually on his gun butt. "You never do. Course, sometimes what you find belongs to someone else. Sometimes taking it, even with good intentions, can get a man in a powerful lot of trouble." The standoff stretched between them like a taut wire. Dan could see the calculations running behind the marshal's eyes, duty warring with pragmatism, the letter of the law against the harsh realities of frontier justice. Around them, the trading post had indeed grown quieter, other patrons sensing the electricity in the air. "Papa?" Eliza's small voice broke through the tension. "Can we go now?" The word hit Dan like a physical blow. Papa. She'd never called him that before, had barely spoken to him at all in those first weeks, but now, sensing danger she couldn't name, she'd claimed him as surely as he'd claimed her. Carpenter heard it too. Dan saw something shift in the marshal's expression, not quite softening, but perhaps a recognition of something more complex than simple theft or kidnapping. "You take care of yourself, Morrison," Carpenter said finally, stepping aside. "And that little girl of yours. Frontier's a dangerous place for a family man." Dan nodded once, gathered their supplies, and guided Eliza toward the door. But he could feel the marshal's eyes on them every step of the way, and he knew their troubles had only just begun. The morning brought snow, not the gentle dusting they'd seen before, but thick, heavy flakes that fell like ash from a grey sky. Dan watched it accumulate on their meager supplies, while Sarah slept fitfully against his side, her small body racked with coughs that seemed to tear something loose in his chest each time. 3 days since they'd fled the trading post. 3 days of pushing deeper into territory he didn't recognize, following game trails that led nowhere and streams that promised nothing. The landscape had grown increasingly hostile, all jagged rock faces and dense stands of pine that blocked the sun, even when it deigned to show itself. Sarah stirred, her eyes opening to slits. "Dan, I'm cold." He pulled the threadbare blanket tighter around her shoulders, though it did little good. The fabric was worn thin, and their fire had died sometime in the night, despite his efforts to bank the coals. "I know, little one. We'll get moving soon, find somewhere warmer." But even as he said it, he knew it was a lie. There was no warmth to be found in this God-forsaken wilderness, no shelter that would keep the cold from seeping into their bones. And Sarah was getting sicker. He'd noticed it yesterday, the flush in her cheeks that spoke of fever, the way she stumbled more frequently, the rattling quality to her breathing. Without proper medicine, proper food, proper shelter, he was watching her fade before his eyes. The guilt sat heavy in his stomach, heavier than hunger. This was his fault. His past had caught up with them, forced them to run when they should have stayed in town, found a doctor, found help. But Bishop Cartwright's men would have found them there, and then— "Tell me about the ocean again," Sarah whispered, interrupting his spiral of self-recrimination. Dan looked down at her pale face, at the trust still shining in her fever-bright eyes, despite everything he'd put her through. "The ocean. You said you'd seen it once, before you came to the valley." He had said that, hadn't he? Back when they'd had a fire and food and the luxury of stories, before the world had collapsed around them again. It was vast, he said slowly, settling back against the rocky outcropping that provided their only shelter. Bigger than anything you can imagine. Blue-green water stretching all the way to the sky. Was it warm? Sometimes. When the sun hit it just right, it would sparkle like jewels scattered across silk. The memory came easier now, pushing back the immediate press of cold and fear, and the sound it made, like breathing but endless, rolling in and out against the shore. Sarah closed her eyes, a small smile touching her lips. "I'd like to see it someday." "You will," Dan promised, though the words felt like stones in his throat. "When you're well, when this is all over, we'll go west, all the way to California." It was another lie, probably. They'd be lucky to survive the week, much less make it to the Pacific, but if stories could give her comfort, he'd tell them until his voice gave out. A sound in the distance made him freeze. Hoofbeats, muffled by the snow but definitely there. His hand moved instinctively to the pistol at his hip, fingers closing around the worn grip. Sarah's eyes snapped open, wide with fear. "Stay quiet," he whispered, easing her deeper into the shadows of the rock face. "Don't move." The riders came into view through the falling snow, 3 men on horseback, moving slowly, methodically, searching. Even at a distance, Dan recognized the purposeful way they scanned the terrain, the careful spacing that spoke of military training. Bishop Cartwright's men had to be. One of them pulled up short, dismounting to examine something on the ground. Tracks, probably, impossible to hide completely in snow, no matter how careful you were. The man pointed in their direction, and Dan's blood turned to ice. They'd been found. Sarah must have sensed the change in him because she pressed closer, trembling. "What is it?" "People looking for us," he said quietly, mind racing through options. They could run, but Sarah was weak, and the snow would make their trail impossible to hide. They could hide, but these men were professionals, and it was only a matter of time. They could fight, but 3 armed men against 1, with a sick child to protect. The riders were moving again, closer now. Close enough that Dan could see the hard set of their faces, the rifles in their hands. Close enough that running was no longer an option. He looked down at Sarah, memorizing her face. The freckles across her nose, the stubborn set of her chin that reminded him so much of her mother. Whatever happened next, whatever price his past demanded, he wouldn't let them hurt her. Couldn't. "Sarah," he whispered urgently, "I need you to listen to me very carefully." The fever broke on the 3rd day, leaving Sarah weak as a newborn colt but alive. Dan had barely slept, keeping vigil beside her makeshift bed in the abandoned cabin they'd found nestled in a grove of aspens. The structure was little more than 4 walls and a sagging roof, but it had kept the wind at bay while the sickness ran its course. "I dreamed about my mama," Sarah whispered, her voice hoarse but clear. She struggled to sit up, and Dan helped her, his calloused hands gentle against her small shoulders. "What did she tell you?" he asked, spooning lukewarm broth between her cracked lips. "That I need to stay strong, that you're taking me somewhere safe." Her eyes, still glassy from the fever, fixed on his face. "Are you Dan? Taking me somewhere safe?" The question hit him like a punch to the gut. Safe. He'd been running from safety for 2 years, and now he was supposed to provide it for this child. The irony wasn't lost on him. "I'm doing my best, little one." Outside, the wind howled through the canyon, carrying with it the scent of snow. Winter was coming fast, faster than he'd hoped. They needed to move, but Sarah wasn't strong enough yet. Another day, maybe 2, and then they'd have to push on regardless. As Sarah drifted back to sleep, Dan stepped outside to check their surroundings. The cabin sat in a natural depression, hidden from the main trail by a stand of rocks and scrub oak. It was a good defensive position, but it was also a trap if someone found them. He was checking the horse when he heard it. The distant sound of voices carried on the wind. His blood turned to ice as he recognized one of them. Bishop Hartwell's distinctive baritone calling out orders to his men. They'd found him. Dan moved quickly, quietly back to the cabin. Sarah was still sleeping, her breathing finally steady and deep. He couldn't wake her, couldn't ask her to run again when she could barely stand. But he couldn't let Hartwell take her either. The voices were getting closer. Dan counted at least 3 men, maybe 4. They were searching methodically, checking every possible hiding place. It would only be a matter of time before they discovered the cabin. He had 2 choices: run with Sarah and hope they could escape in her weakened condition, or make a stand. Neither option gave them good odds. "Brother Carver." The voice came from just outside the door, calm and measured. "I know you're in there. We've been tracking you for days." Dan's hand moved instinctively to the pistol at his hip, then stopped. What was he thinking? These were his people, members of his own faith, but they were also men who would take Sarah from him, who would see her placed in an institution where she'd be forgotten, lost among dozens of other orphans. "Let's talk, Dan. Just you and me." Against every instinct screaming at him to stay silent, Dan opened the door. Bishop Hartwell stood alone in the small clearing, his hands visible and empty. The man looked older than Dan remembered, his beard more grey than brown, lines of weariness etched deep around his eyes. "Bishop." Dan kept his voice neutral, his body positioned to block any view of the cabin's interior. "You look terrible, my boy. This life on the trail doesn't suit you." Hartwell's eyes were kind but firm. "It's time to come home. This is about the girl, partly. But it's about you too. You can't keep running from what happened, from what you did." The words hit their mark, and Dan felt the familiar weight of guilt settle on his shoulders like a lead blanket. "I did what I had to do. You killed 3 men, Dan, members of our community. Their families deserve justice. Their families deserve to know the truth about what their sons were doing to those Indian children." The words came out harsher than he'd intended, sharp with old anger and fresh grief. Hartwell's expression softened slightly. "The council has heard your claims. We're willing to consider that there may have been mitigating circumstances, but you have to come back. You have to face this properly. And the girl? She'll be cared for. You have my word." Dan almost laughed. Cared for, institutionalized, more like. Fed and clothed and housed with dozens of other forgotten children until she grew old enough to be married off to whoever needed a wife. That wasn't caring, it was warehousing. Behind him, he heard Sarah stir, a small sound of confusion as she woke to voices she didn't recognize. The sound made his decision for him. "I can't do that, Bishop." Hartwell's face hardened. "Then I'm afraid you've forced my hand." He raised his voice slightly. "Brothers, please join us." 3 men emerged from the trees, rifles in hand, but not yet raised. Dan recognized 2 of them, young men he'd helped teach to shoot, to track, to survive in this unforgiving country. Now they'd come to take away the only family he had left. The storm broke just after midnight, unleashing a fury that seemed to shake the very bones of the earth. Dan pressed himself against the rock face, pulling Lily deeper into the shallow overhang they'd found as darkness fell. The wind howled like something alive and angry, driving sheets of rain that turned the narrow ledge slick and treacherous. "I can't see anything," Lily whispered, a small hand clutching his sleeve. Lightning split the sky, illuminating the canyon walls in stark white relief before plunging them back into absolute darkness. "Stay close," Dan murmured, though his own voice was nearly lost in the tempest. He'd weathered storms before, but not like this, not with someone depending on him for survival. The overhang provided meager shelter, barely wide enough for both of them, and water cascaded from the rock above like a waterfall. Thunder crashed overhead, so close it seemed to originate from within his chest. Lily pressed against him, trembling, and he wrapped his arm around her shoulders, feeling how small and fragile she was beneath the sodden blanket. Her fever had broken 2 days ago, but she was still weak, still recovering from the sickness that had nearly claimed her. The rain intensified, if such a thing were possible. In the brief moments when lightning illuminated their surroundings, Dan could see water rushing down the canyon floor below them, transforming the dry wash into a raging torrent. Flash flood. He'd heard stories of men and livestock swept away in minutes by such sudden deluges, their bodies found miles downstream days later. Dan! Lily's voice was barely audible above the storm. Are we going to die? The question hit him harder than any physical blow. He thought of all the times he'd faced death, welcomed it even, in those dark months after Sarah's passing. But now, with this child's life in his hands, the prospect filled him with a terror he'd never known. No, he said firmly, though he wasn't certain he believed it. We're going to wait this out, and come morning we'll keep moving. Another flash of lightning, and in that brief illumination, he saw something that made his blood run cold. The water level below was rising rapidly, and their rocky shelf sat barely 10 feet above what had been the canyon floor. If the flood continued to climb, they'd be trapped with nowhere to go. He peered upward, trying to gauge the rock face above them. In daylight, he might have attempted to climb higher, but in this darkness, with the rock face slick from rain, it would be suicide. And Lily was too weak, too small to make such an ascent, even under ideal conditions. The wind shifted, driving rain directly into their shelter. Lily coughed, a harsh sound that reminded him of how close he'd come to losing her to the fever. He pulled her closer, using his body to shield her from the worst of the elements. Tell me about her again, Lily said suddenly. About who? Sarah, your wife. Dan's throat tightened. He'd spoken of Sarah only once during their journey, in a moment of weakness when grief had overwhelmed his usual reticence. But now, with death potentially stalking them in the rising flood, he found himself wanting to remember, to speak her name aloud. She had the most beautiful laugh, he began, his voice barely carrying over the storm. Like music. She could find joy in the smallest things, a wildflower growing through a crack in a rock, the way morning light fell across our cabin floor. Lightning flickered again, and he saw that the water below had risen another foot. They had hours at most before it reached their level. She would have loved you, he continued, pushing down his growing panic. Sarah always wanted children. We tried for years, but... He let the words trail off, unable to voice the old pain. Maybe God saved me for you, Lily said softly. Maybe he knew you needed someone to take care of. The simple faith in her words staggered him. Here, in the midst of a storm that could kill them both, this child was trying to comfort him. He thought of all the times he'd cursed God, blamed him for every loss and hardship. But looking at Lily now, he wondered if perhaps divine providence worked in ways too complex for his understanding. A new sound reached them through the storm, a low rumble that seemed to come from upstream. Dan's blood turned to ice. He knew that sound, had heard it described by survivors of flash floods, a wall of water and debris rolling down the canyon like a locomotive. Hold on to me, he told Lily, wrapping both arms around her. Whatever happens, don't let go. The rumble grew louder, and in the next lightning flash he saw it, a churning mass of water and uprooted trees bearing down on them with unstoppable force. He pressed Lily against the rock wall and braced himself, knowing that in moments they would discover whether their precarious shelter could withstand nature's assault. The storm had passed, but its fury left scars across the landscape that mirrored the ones carved into Dan's soul. He stood at the edge of their makeshift shelter, watching dawn break over a world transformed by ice and wind. The child stirred behind him, her breathing shallow but steady. We can't stay here, he murmured, more to himself than to her. Their supplies had dwindled to nothing, and the cold had settled into his bones like an old enemy come to visit. Sarah's eyes opened, bright with fever. Dan, are you really there? He knelt beside her, pressing his palm to her forehead. The heat radiating from her skin made his stomach clench with worry. I'm here, little one. Always here. I dreamed about the fire again, she whispered. But this time you were in it too. The words hit him like a physical blow. He'd been dreading this moment, knowing that eventually the past would catch up to them both. The child deserved the truth, but truth was a luxury they couldn't afford in this wilderness. "Just a dream," he said, but his voice carried the weight of lies he'd been carrying for months. Sarah struggled to sit up, her small hands gripping his arm with surprising strength. "Tell me about before you found me. Tell me about the men who are following us." Dan's breath caught. "What men? I see them sometimes when I close my eyes. 3 men on horses. They know you, don't they?" The shelter suddenly felt smaller, the walls closing in like a trap. How could she know about Marcus Kellerman and his brothers? How could a child barely 7 years old carry visions of men she'd never seen? "Sarah, you need to rest." "They're not far behind us now," she continued, her voice taking on an eerie quality that made the hair on his neck stand up. "The one with the scar on his face, he's angry. He says you stole something from him." Dan's hand moved instinctively to the hidden pocket in his coat where he kept the documents. Papers that proved Marcus Kellerman had been selling arms to hostile tribes, using Mormon supply trains as cover. Evidence that could hang a man if it ever reached the territorial authorities. "How do you know this?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Sarah's fever-bright eyes seemed to look right through him. "The same way I know you didn't just find me by that burned handcart. You were running from them that day, weren't you? And when you saw what happened to my family, you decided to run with me instead." The truth sat between them like a loaded gun. Dan had been fleeing west when he'd stumbled upon the massacre, Kellerman's men only hours behind him. The sight of the child among the carnage had changed everything. He could have kept running, could have saved himself. Instead, he'd chosen to become her guardian, her family, her protector. "They killed my parents because they wouldn't give up their water rights," Sarah continued, her voice growing stronger despite the fever. "And they'll kill us both to get those papers back." Dan stared at her, wondering when the frightened orphan had become this wise, haunted creature who seemed to understand more about their situation than he'd ever told her. "You've known all along," he said finally. "I've known pieces, dreams mostly, but they're getting clearer." She coughed, and blood flecked her lips. "We don't have much time." Outside, the wind picked up again, carrying with it a sound that made Dan's blood run cold. Horses, still distant but closing fast. He moved to the shelter's opening and peered through the frozen landscape. 3 dark shapes moved across the white expanse, like demons rising from hell itself. Marcus Kellerman had found them. "Can you travel?" he asked, already knowing the answer. Sarah could barely sit up, let alone endure another grueling day in the saddle. "Leave me," she said simply. "Take the papers and go. Make sure justice finds them." "Never." The word came out harsher than he intended. "I promise to be your family. Families don't abandon each other." Sarah smiled then, and for a moment she looked like the child she was supposed to be. "Then we fight." Dan checked his rifle, counting the remaining ammunition. 6 shots, 3 men. The mathematics of survival had never been grimmer. "There's something else," Sarah said, her voice fading as the fever pulled her back toward unconsciousness. "Something I remember from that night. My father gave me something before he died, something important." She fumbled with the small leather pouch she wore around her neck, the one Dan had assumed contained childhood treasures. From it, she withdrew a brass key. "The strong box in Millerville," she whispered. "More evidence, enough to finish them all." The sound of approaching horses grew louder. Dan tucked the key into his pocket beside the documents and picked up his rifle. Whatever came next, they would face it together. The storm had passed, leaving behind a crystalline morning that made the snow sparkle like scattered diamonds. Dan worked methodically, breaking camp while Sarah sat wrapped in both their blankets, her small face pale but determined. The fever had broken during the night, but she remained weak, her movements careful and measured. "We'll take it slow today," Dan said, rolling up his bedroll. "No need to push hard." Sarah nodded, then looked up at him with those clear blue eyes that seemed to see too much. "Dan," Last night, when I was sick, you kept saying a name. Anna. His hands stilled on the rope he was tying. The morning air suddenly felt thinner, harder to breathe. You were dreaming, little one. No. Her voice was soft but certain. You were awake. You were holding my hand and saying you were sorry to someone named Anna, over and over. Dan's chest tightened. He'd thought he'd been careful, thought he'd buried those words deep enough that they wouldn't surface. But fever and exhaustion had a way of stripping away a man's defenses. Who was she? Sarah asked. For a long moment, Dan said nothing. He finished with the rope, checked their supplies, adjusted the crude travois he'd constructed from fallen branches. All the while, he felt the weight of Sarah's gaze, patient and expectant. Finally, he sat down beside her on a fallen log. Anna was my daughter. The words came out rougher than he'd intended, scraping against his throat like broken glass. Sarah's eyes widened, but she didn't speak. She simply waited, and somehow that made it easier to continue. He was about your age, maybe a year younger, hair the color of wheat and freckles across her nose that she hated but I thought were beautiful. His voice grew distant, remembering. She had your stubbornness too. Once she set her mind to something, nothing could change it. What happened to her? Dan's hands clenched into fists on his knees. This was the part he'd never spoken aloud. Not to anyone. The part that had driven him from his community, from everything he'd known. There was a raid. Ute warriors, angry about settlers pushing into their hunting grounds. They hit our settlement at dawn while most of the men were out checking the cattle. He paused, forcing himself to continue. I was supposed to be there. Should have been there. But I'd ridden out the night before to track some missing horses. Thought I'd be back by morning. Sarah's small hand found his, warm and steady. By the time I returned, it was over. Most of the families had made it to the church, barricaded themselves in. But Anna, his voice broke. She'd gone back for her doll, the one her mother made before she died, giving birth. Anna couldn't sleep without it. The wind whispered through the pines above them, a sound like mourning. I found her in our cabin. She'd grabbed the doll and was trying to get back to safety when... He couldn't finish, couldn't say the words that would make it real again. That's why you left, Sarah said quietly. It wasn't a question. The elders said it was God's will, that I had to accept it and move forward in faith. But I couldn't. I couldn't understand how a God who claimed to love his children could let something like that happen. Not to Anna, not to someone so innocent. So you stopped believing. Dan looked down at their joined hands. I stopped believing in a lot of things. In God, in community, in my own worth as a man. I became someone else, someone harder. But you saved me. I failed her, Sarah, my own daughter, and I wasn't there when she needed me most. What if I fail you too? Sarah was quiet for a long time. When she finally spoke, her voice held a wisdom that seemed far beyond her years. My papa used to say that God doesn't promise us we won't face storms. He promises he won't let us face them alone. She squeezed his hand. Maybe you weren't there for Anna at the end, but you're here for me now. Maybe that's what Anna would want. Dan felt tears he'd held back for 2 years finally break free. They fell silently onto the snow between his boots, each drop carrying some small portion of the weight he'd carried alone for so long. I dream about her sometimes, he admitted. She tells me to stop running. Maybe you should listen. He looked at this remarkable child who'd somehow found her way into his broken life and began piecing it back together without him even realizing it. Maybe I should. They sat together in the quiet morning, 2 wounded souls finding strength in shared grief. When Dan finally stood and shouldered their pack, something had shifted between them. The last wall had come down. Come on, daughter, he said, the word feeling right for the first time. Let's go home. The fever broke on the 3rd day, leaving Eliza weak but lucid. Dan sat beside her makeshift bed in the abandoned cabin they'd found, watching color slowly return to her pale cheeks. Outside, snow continued to fall in thick curtains, sealing them into this temporary sanctuary. You stayed, she whispered. her voice barely audible. "Where else would I go?" Dan replied, though they both knew he could have left a dozen times. Should have left, perhaps. The storm would cover his tracks completely. Eliza struggled to sit up, and he helped her, noting how light she'd become. "You're not like the others who hurt me before." The words hit him like a physical blow. Dan turned away, unable to meet her trusting eyes. "Eliza, there's something I know about the bounty," she said quietly. His blood turned to ice. "What?" "I've known for weeks. I saw the poster in Millfield when you thought I was sleeping in the wagon." Her small hand found his weathered one. $500 for Dan Carver, wanted for desertion and theft of military supplies. The cabin fell silent except for the wind howling through the chinks in the walls. Dan felt the weight of his deception crashing down around him. "Then you know what I am." "I know what you were," Eliza corrected. "I don't know why you deserted, but I know you saved me when you could have taken that money and run." Dan pulled his hand away, standing abruptly. "You don't understand. The supplies I stole, they were meant for an outpost protecting a wagon train. Because of what I did, 23 people died in an Apache raid, including children." The words tore from his throat like broken glass. Eliza was quiet for a long moment. "Why did you take them?" "My commanding officer was selling supplies to whiskey traders instead of protecting settlers. I had proof, but he was a colonel's nephew. When I threatened to report him, he had me court-martialed on false charges." Dan stared out the frost-covered window. "I broke out the night before my execution, took what supplies I could carry to try to reach that wagon train myself, warned them. But you didn't make it in time." "No. Found the wreckage 2 days later. Vultures had already..." He couldn't finish. The cabin creaked under the weight of accumulated snow. Eliza watched him carefully, her young face grave with understanding beyond her years. "So you've been running ever since?" "Until I found you." Dan turned back to her. "Until I made a promise I had no right to make. A man like me with blood on his hands, I'm not fit to be anyone's family." "But you are my family," Eliza said with quiet certainty. "When I was dying of fever, you could have walked away. When that bear attacked, you put yourself between us. When I had nightmares about my parents, you sang me the songs your mother taught you." Tears tracked down her thin cheeks. "Those dead people, their blood isn't on your hands. It's on your commanding officers. I failed them. You tried to save them, just like you saved me." Eliza struggled to stand, swaying slightly. "The difference is I'm still here. I'm still alive because of you." Dan wanted to argue, to push her away before his past destroyed her too. But something in her eyes, not just trust, but fierce loyalty, made the words die in his throat. "There are men looking for me," he said instead. "Bounty hunters who won't care that you're just a child. If they find us, then we keep moving." Eliza's voice grew stronger. "We reach California like we planned. We start over. It won't be that simple. My face is on wanted posters from here to... Then we change your face." Eliza moved to their supply pack, pulling out a small mirror. "Shave the beard, cut your hair. The poster shows a man who looks like a soldier. Make yourself look like a settler." Dan stared at his reflection. The man looking back was indeed the deserter from the poster. Lean, hard-eyed, bearing the unmistakable bearing of military service. But underneath, perhaps there was still something of the farm boy he'd been before the war. "Why?" he asked. "Why risk everything for someone like me?" Eliza set down the mirror and took his hands in both of hers. "Because you're not someone like you anymore. You're my father now, and families don't abandon each other." The word father hit him like a revelation. Not guardian, not protector, father. The title he'd never dared claim, even in his own thoughts. Outside, the storm was beginning to weaken. Soon they'd need to move again, to keep ahead of Winter and the men who hunted him. But for this moment, in this crude shelter, they were simply what they'd chosen to become, a damaged man and an orphaned girl, bound together by something stronger than blood. "All right," Dan said finally. "Help me with the razor." The storm had passed, leaving behind a crystalline world that hurt to look at. Dan's breath came in ragged puffs as he crested the final ridge, Lily's weight heavier than ever across his shoulders. Below them, Fort Bridger spread like a promise against the white canvas of snow, wooden buildings with smoke curling from chimneys, the American flag snapping in the wind, people moving between structures like ants with purpose. "There, little one," he whispered against her ear. "We made it." But Lily didn't respond. She hadn't spoken in 2 days, not since the fever took hold. Her small body burned against his back even through the layers of blankets he'd wrapped around her. Each labored breath she took seemed to echo in his chest, and he found himself counting them, terrified that each might be her last. The descent proved treacherous. Ice had formed over the snow, creating a treacherous shell that broke unexpectedly under his boots. Twice he nearly fell, catching himself only by grabbing at stunted pine branches that cut through his gloves and into his palms. But he held her tight, adjusting his grip constantly to ensure she stayed secure. As they approached the fort's gates, a sentry called out, "Hold there! State your business." "Medicine," Dan croaked, his voice barely carrying across the distance. "The child needs a doctor." The gates opened, and suddenly there were hands reaching for them, voices calling out orders. A bearded man in a blue uniform took charge immediately. "Get them inside. Martha, fetch the doctor. You there, bring blankets and hot soup." They carried Lily to the infirmary while Dan stumbled alongside, refusing to let go of her hand. The doctor, a thin man with kind eyes and steady hands, began his examination immediately. He peeled away the layers of blankets, revealing Lily's flushed face and the angry red spots that had appeared on her arms and chest. "Scarlet fever," the doctor murmured, already reaching for his medical bag. "How long has she been like this?" 3 days since the rash appeared, Dan said, swaying on his feet. "Maybe 4. Time got away from me." "Sit down before you fall down," the doctor ordered without looking up from Lily. "You're no good to her if you collapse." But Dan remained standing, watching as the doctor worked. The man moved with practiced efficiency, checking Lily's pulse, listening to her breathing, preparing medications. Other people flowed in and out of the room, the fort's commander wanting a report, a woman bringing tea, soldiers curious about the strangers who'd emerged from the wilderness. "She's a fighter," the doctor said, after what felt like hours. "The fever's high, but not dangerously so. With proper care and medicine, she should recover. But it'll be touch and go for the next day or 2. Dan finally allowed himself to sink into a chair beside her bed. His hands shook as he reached out to brush a strand of hair from Lily's forehead. Her skin was so hot it seemed to burn his fingertips. "You did well getting her here," the doctor continued. "Another day in that cold and—" He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. As night fell, Dan kept vigil beside Lily's bed. The fort's commander, a gruff man named Morrison, had offered him proper quarters, but Dan refused to leave her side. Instead, he sat in the wooden chair, listening to her breathing, watching for any change in her condition. It was near midnight when she stirred. Her eyes fluttered open, unfocused and glassy with fever, but aware. "Dan," she whispered, her voice like rustling leaves. "I'm here," he said, leaning forward to take her hand. "I'm right here. Are we safe?" The question hit him like a physical blow. All this time, through everything they'd endured, she'd been worried about safety, not just from the cold or the hunger or the wild animals, but from the secrets he carried, from the past that followed him like a shadow. "Yes," he said, and meant it. "We're safe." She smiled then, the first real smile he'd seen from her in days, before her eyes drifted closed again. But this time her breathing was easier, more natural. The crisis had passed. Dan leaned back in his chair and finally allowed exhaustion to wash over him. They'd made it. Against all odds, through blizzards and starvation and his own dark past, they'd survived. Lily would recover, would grow up, would have the life her parents had died trying to give her. But as relief flooded through him, another feeling crept in, one he hadn't expected. Fear, not of pursuit or discovery, but of what came next. He'd spent so long focused on survival, on reaching safety, that he hadn't considered what would happen once they arrived. What kind of father could he be to this child? What kind of future could he offer her? Outside, the wind howled around the fort's walls, but inside the infirmary, warmth held sway. For the first time in months, they were truly safe. The morning sun cast long shadows across the valley floor as Dan loaded the last of their supplies into the wagon. 3 months had passed since they'd settled in Silver Creek, and the small community had welcomed them with the kind of quiet acceptance that came from understanding hardship. Sarah sat on the porch steps, braiding wildflowers into a crown, her laughter carrying on the crisp autumn air. "We don't have to leave," she said, without looking up from her handiwork. "I heard Mrs. Patterson telling her husband that you're the best carpenter they've had in these parts." Dan paused, his hands resting on the wagon's edge. The offer to stay permanently had come 3 times now, each more generous than the last. Work was steady, the people were good, and Sarah had friends her own age. It would be easy to sink roots here, to pretend the past couldn't reach them in this remote valley, but pretending had never been his strength. "Sarah." He turned to face her, his weathered hands hanging at his sides. "There's something I need to tell you, something I should have told you a long time ago." She looked up, and he saw his own features reflected in her face, the stubborn set of her jaw, the way her eyes narrowed when she was thinking. Features that had nothing to do with coincidence or wishful thinking. "I know," she said quietly. The words hit him like a physical blow. "You know? I figured it out weeks ago." She set the flower crown aside and stood, smoothing her skirts with hands that trembled slightly. "You have the same scar on your left hand that I do, same place, same shape. You told me once that scars like that run in families." Dan stared at his hand, at the thin white line across his knuckles where his father's belt buckle had caught him as a child. He'd never noticed the matching mark on Sarah's hand, had never thought to look for the signs of his own blood in her face. "Your mother," he began, then stopped. How could he explain what he'd done? How could he tell her that he'd abandoned them both? "Her name was Elizabeth," Sarah said. "She used to sing while she worked, and she made the best cornbread in 3 counties. She married a man named James when I was 4, and he was good to us until the fever took him. That's when we joined the Handcart company." Dan's legs gave out, and he sank onto the wagon seat. Elizabeth. He'd loved her with the desperate intensity of a young man who thought love could conquer anything. But when she'd told him about the baby, when the weight of responsibility had settled on his shoulders like chains, he'd run. Joined the army, fought in wars that had nothing to do with him, anything to escape the terror of becoming the kind of father his own had been. "She never told me about you," Sarah continued, her voice steady despite the tears on her cheeks. "But sometimes, when she thought I was sleeping, I'd hear her talking to someone who wasn't there, asking why they'd left us, wondering if they were safe." The guilt that had driven him for 17 years crashed over him like a flash flood. All those years of wondering, of telling himself that they were better off without him. All those nights when he'd stared at the stars and tried to convince himself that leaving had been the right choice. "I was afraid," he whispered. "My father, he was a hard man. I was terrified I'd become him. But you didn't." Sarah walked to the wagon and climbed up beside him. "You saved me. You kept your promise." "What promise?" "The one you made to her." She reached into her pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper, yellowed with age and worn soft from handling. "She carried this everywhere. Made me promise to keep it if anything happened to her." With shaking hands, Dan unfolded the paper. His own handwriting stared back at him, young and careless. "I promise to come back for you and the baby. I promise we'll be a family. I love you both." D. A sob tore from his throat, raw and broken. "I never came back, but you found me anyway." Sarah's hand covered his, small and warm and forgiving. Maybe that's what matters. They sat in silence as the sun climbed higher, father and daughter finally seeing each other clearly. The past couldn't be changed, but the future stretched ahead of them like an unwritten page. "So," Sarah said finally, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand, "are we staying or going?" Dan looked around the valley, at the life they could build here, at the peace they'd both fought so hard to find. For the first time in 17 years, he felt the weight of his secrets lift from his shoulders. "We're staying," he said. "We're home."